Well, here it is, folks. My reaction to the interview, which I just listened to, the audio version, which you heard earlier on the WWE Network, the interview with Vince McMahon and Stone Cold Steve Austin on Austin's podcast, which was featured for the first time ever on the WWE Network. A lot of stuff to digest. I have a lot of notes, but I'll try to. I really feel like Vince did dance around certain issues. But the two biggest issues he was most poignant on, which really took my breath away, were CM Punk to some extent, and then they ended the conversation talking about the Undertaker streak. So, some really good nuggets, some stuff just like the CM Punk interview, some stuff we've been waiting to hear from the horse's mouth for a long time. But here we go. Let's break the glass, let's crack open a few cold ones, and let's talk about the Rattlesnakes sit down with the boss, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, the chairman of the board himself, the one and only Vince. Talks about the WWE Network. Austin asked him about the England situation and the expectations. Vince said it was meeting Vince's expectations, kind of passively, kind of danced around this one. Didn't really talk about the England situation too much. So, and we had some initial kind of dancing and feeling out from Vince McMahon. As Steve Austin was very direct with his first question. Boom. Didn't fluff it. Didn't waste any time. What's the deal with the network? And then Vince talked about giving fans what they want, and Austin started saying the 3-hour Raws are a little bit long sometimes, and he talks about, just the 3 hours and telling stories, and I know Austin was not keen on the opening promos. They seem very repetitious every week, same formula, but Vince had a good rebuttal on that one, like, hey, you gotta set up the deal, you gotta tell stories, and, I can't knock Vince for his, at least, rebuttal to Steve Austin, I thought Vince was kind of starting to warm up there and give you a little bit more than he did on the network, which that was the one he really danced on, I thought. But, he talks about how some matches hit, some matches don't, and, Steve Austin then asked him a very interesting question, talks about the backstage walking on eggshells, and, Vince pretty much even said, hey, don't piss anyone off. But he said these millennials, they're not ambitious. They're not trepidatious. Quite interesting. And then he said something that really pissed me off, quite frankly. He said, no one's grabbing the brass ring, and you saw CM Punk talk about that in his infamous pipe bomb promo. And he literally said, no one has grabbed the brass ring since John Cena. Are you kidding me, Vincent Kennedy McMahon? Wow, that one blew my mind. Like, talk about that showed his true feelings on John Cena right there, and how he holds him, and, like, wow, like, has he just, like, completely had no respect for anyone on the roster besides John Cena? And he mentioned Randy Orton in the interview, but, like, John's the only guy who's grabbed the brass ring. I mean, what about Edge? What about Chris Jericho when he came back and reinvented himself? What about Batista? I mean, what about Rob Van Dam? What about CM Punk? What about Daniel Bryan? I mean, are you kidding me? No one has grabbed the brass ring. That one insulted my intelligence. Come on. I don't know what Vince's definition of grabbing the brass ring is, and it's funny, they would go on to talk about CM Punk, and, there was some comparisons made with Austin and Punk, with two very infamous situations, which we as wrestling fans are all familiar with. But, certainly, I mean, like, to say that John Cena is the only one that's grabbed the brass ring, since, the Attitude Era is pretty much how Vince put it, insulting. I mean, come on now. That's ridiculous. I'm floored by that statement right there. Like, they've had a lot of talent over the past 10 years, and now, you saw him give credit to some of the newer talent, the younger talent, and, like, Vince talked about, insecurity, and the guys he did like from today, like, he threw 4 names out there, and it was Bray Wyatt, Seth Rollins, Dean Ambrose, and Roman Reigns. No surprise, all guys who have been very heavily pushed since their debut in NXT. Bray Wyatt with the Wyatt family, and the Shield, and, since the Shield was split apart, all three have gone on to very good success, and it seems like they're very aggressive in trying to become the top stars for the next generation, and that's what I like to see, and that's clearly what Vince likes to see. So I think these four gentlemen have a great chance of really being stars the next, 5 to 10 years. Bray Wyatt, Dean Ambrose, Seth Rollins, and of course the big man Roman Reigns. I think we're looking at really the crop of the future and really how it's going to be shaped with those four guys. You heard it from Vince's mouth. That's the guy who makes the decision, folks. This interview he did, very rare. Like, this is definitely the best thing. I don't subscribe to the network, but in my opinion, this is the best thing the network's ever given us. It's only a half-hour interview, but chock full of so much stuff. And Steve Austin goes to challenge the locker room. Said, what's the locker room lacking? He said, or what does Vince want in a superstar? He said charisma, heart, work ethic, the ability to learn, verbal, passion. The complete package, which I understand what he's talking about with that answer. Talks about how the audience can make or break a star, and that's certainly true. Whether Vince listens to the audience is a different story. Then Steve Austin brings up Cesaro and asked about him and how, he looked like he was going to turn babyface and have the singles push after the Real Americans, but then was put back heel and fell to the pack. And, Vince was very critical. He said he loved his in-ring work, but his charisma, his verbal was lacking. He attributed it to him being Swiss, which that one kind of bothered me. I mean, you represent an international company now, and a guy like him, he has charisma. It's like, do you watch your own YouTube channel, Vince? The stuff he's doing on the JBL show? Come on, Vince. You're better than that, young fella. Old fella. Sir. Unbelievable. And, he lacks it, and Vince straight up says he doesn't know, he doesn't have all the answers, and he doesn't know what to do to take. So that's, to me, kind of flooring, and I do think Vince should watch his own programming or listen to his own programming on his YouTube channel where Cesaro is featured being a very sarcastic character in the JBL show. Watch your own product. Wow, what a shock. They talked about the writing staff and, talked about how it grew over the years when Austin left to this Colossus writing staff that it is now. And Vince attributed to changing with the times, the company, how big it grew. And I guess, understand where he's coming from. Austin compared it to him and to Vince and Pat Patterson writing all the shows. And JR and other guys would stop by and help out. And they would get thrown in the pool. Then a hilarious story about Shane was told where Shane threw Vince in the pool. And Vince tried to chase and get him, but Shane drew off. Real classic story. And this gave rise to Vince talking about Shane. Another topic that I know wrestling fans across the world have really been waiting for Vince to talk about is really the status of his son, how he left the company, and just his overall thoughts on Shane McMahon. And he was very candid. He talked about, going to Japan. He's happy with his family. He essentially said it was a mutual parting the ways. He talked about, his deal in Japan. And, he says pretty much very nice things about Shane, and he says it's not easy to work with family, with your father, how Linda left the company to pursue politics, and he, so interesting stuff on that, and I was very glad that Shane McMahon was acknowledged in this interview. Props to Steve Austin, asked some excellent questions. Oh my God, Austin, wow. Then there's a funny story about Shane asking Vince for a raise when Shane worked in the warehouse when he was just cutting his cloth as a college kid. And he would work in the WWE warehouse in the summer. Vince wouldn't give it to him, and Shane went to a different factory and got almost double the pay. So early on, Shane was never shy to go do his own thing, and I think that makes Vince proud in a way. Vince, to me, sometimes likes a defiant person. Vince talks about his announcer debut. A lot of that had been covered in other DVD releases. How his dad fired Ray Morgan on the spot because Ray Morgan refused to go out without getting a pay raise. He fired him, shingled his famous quarters in his hand, and said, "Vince, you're up." And Vince didn't have any announcing experience. He said the worst person he ever worked with was Arnold Skoland, the former manager of Bruno Sammartino and Bob Backlund, saying he just lacked charisma and personality, and just as a color man, he just go, yep, nope, yep, nope. sounds like Daniel Bryan's gimmick now. But regardless, that was kind of funny. He threw Arnold Skaaland under the bus, and like, you know, a little addition to the story we've always heard. You know, especially if you got the Vince DVD and other projects like that. And then here it is, the two biggest thing, CM Punk. Vince apologizes to CM Punk for sending his firing papers on his wedding day, said that was a bad coincidence, said, you know, Punk is disgruntled, but he does hope to do business again. Like, it's very interesting. Vince is kind of the Jim Ross in this situation. Steve Austin compared the situation to when he had walked out, very famously, when he went and put over Brock Lesnar and he walked out of the company for a while, and, you know, Vince talked about having to fine him $650,000, and how Steve Austin bartered down to get it to $250,000. But that story had never been told on any platform by Vince or Austin. That was really good to hear. But I mean, you know, says he's friends with Lesnar's now and stuff, and talked about ego. Talked about Jim Ross was the middleman who, after ignoring Vince's phone calls for months, a card from Jim Ross, you know, sparked the conversation and the communication to bring Steve Austin back. And, you know, there just doesn't seem to be a guy like that for the CM Punk situation. If anything, Vince is that guy. You know, CM Punk on the Colt Cabana podcast talked about Triple H texting him. Maybe it should have been Vince McMahon who, you know, a week after he quit, you know, I didn't mention this in my Punk review, but a week after Punk quit, he texted him, "Yep, you're ready to go back to work, pal." But, you know, very interesting. He wants to work with CM Punk again. I feel like a lot of regret came through to what Vince McMahon was saying. If you're reading between the lines, nothing was mentioned about Hunter or Triple H. At least, you know, I heard it up to the 32-minute part. I don't know if there was any more, but nothing was mentioned about Hunter or Triple H in that role, really, except for that he's not really the mediator there. But it's a very tough situation. Triple H doing a lot of good things for the company. One thing Vince said, though, he was like, Ultimate Warrior ended up doing business again. Steve Austin did business again. Hulk Hogan, a lot of heat there, did business again. So never say never. And clearly Vince is hopeful that Phillip Brooks will step back in a WWE ring someday, despite what he said on Thanksgiving on Colt Cabana's podcast. So, quite the interesting stuff. Said he did not listen to the podcast. Did a oof when Steve Austin brought up the podcast, and he said Punk's entitled to his opinion, and, you know, I think he touched upon the royalties a little bit and everything, and he said he apologized for that too. It's the legal situation getting in the way. Like, Vince was very accountable. I mean, you know, it's funny, Steve Austin said the worst professional decision he ever made was walking out in the company, and there was a lot of comparisons made between Steve Austin and CM Punk, but Vince said that Austin was more of a locker room guy, and that, you know, he was accountable to the boys, and he just kind of said that CM Punk's a loner, and yeah, we know that CM Punk has his very tight circle. He is a loner, so I mean, it's not anything we don't know, but it's very interesting to hear the chairman of the board, the boss, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, speak on CM Punk. You know, talked about how Steve Austin walking on let the fans down, obviously comparing that to Punk as well, and then talked about. First of all, Vince admitted that he was shy. That was a shocking confession. In small crowds, Vince can be shy and just hang with the bartender because that's his people. But the last big tidbit, he talked about The Undertaker, said it was his decision to end the streak, said all things come to an end, and it was time for Undertaker to give back, and said he didn't believe in anyone on the roster, which kind of shocked me, and said, you know, Brock Lesnar was that believable guy, and Mark said, okay, like, pretty much said Mark Calloway, The Undertaker, co-signed on it. So this was very interesting stuff, folks. A very interesting development. And Vince actually stands by the fact, and he says he made the right call. What do you think? Did Vince McMahon make the right call to end the streak? Is he being accountable by his words on CM Punk? Did you like what he had to say about creative, about writing, about Cesaro, about Steve Austin, about Jim Ross? So many different topics he covered. Very candid interview, and I gotta say, Steve Austin, cold one for you, brother. Cold, ice cold soda for you. You did great, sir. Joe Passarelli, subscribe. Wrestling Throwdown later. Raw Review. Strike Zone this Thursday. RickRadio.org. Mike Sorkin, Jazzman, Nate Grist, Joey Dice. RICradio.org. Joe Passarelli, subscribe. YouTube. And that's the bottom line, because Joe Passarelli said so.